Richard, good morning. It's lovely to be talking with you today. How are you?
I am great, Natalie. It's great to be talking to you too. And just for the people listening into this, they need to know that, if this was the other way round and I'd had flu all week, there's no way I'd be talking to you today. So big up
Well, I'm
to
glad to hear it.
the host.
Oh, you sweetie. Thanks. Yeah, you can hear I'm still slightly nasal, but hopefully people will forgive me for that. But thank you. So let's dive in. I'm going to open with a question that I always like to start from, which was offered to me years ago by a psychotherapist friend. It's kind of got a Jungian vibe to it. But the question is, if we were to imagine that there is a global human psyche, how might you think about or feel about what's happening in that psyche right now in
Wow.
February of 2026?
Wow. That's let's go deep straight away. I mean,
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing that humanity is feeling right now is a sense of deep uncertainty. And I think what's really interesting about that, and for those people that are listening that might already know or might look into my background, will know that I was at one time in my career an educator for a couple of
Yeah.
decades. People can blame me. That's the way I feel about this. So the global psyche in crisis right now is one of, I think, fear, dread, uncertainty, a sense of disenfranchisement. And I think to an extent it is my fault or my sector's fault. And I'll try and, if I can, sort of unpick that for you. So if you think about it, we have all been raised and educated well, in a well-meaning sense. This isn't kind of nefarious, right? In a well-meaning sense, we have all been raised and educated to believe that if we work hard, get our heads down and do what we're told, our reward will basically be certainty, right? So
Yeah.
from a very early age, do this, do what you're told, and you will go back to the school education scenario. Get your head down, pass your tests. Pass your tests, you'll get a certificate. The certificate will open the next door. The next door, what you have to do is do the same thing again and again and again. Then you get into employment, you get into a job, and you are told, be indispensable, get your head down, do your job properly, meet your targets, make sure that your professional development ticks the boxes your boss wants you to tick. Do all of those things, and your reward will be certainty. And of course, the older we get, certainty is kind of predicated on an economic model of, again, perfectly reasonable, of you'll have a decent salary. And if you have a decent salary, you'll be able to squirrel a little bit away for a pension, maybe a little bit for a holiday. If you're on a decent, good salary, you can probably get a mortgage, buy a home, get a good long-term rental, whatever that might be. But the point is, it'll be certain. Now, there's no necessary promise for mass humanity that it'll be affluent. It's certainty. And that's the primary step. So I think what we've ended up with is a situation where people have been immaculately educated and raised to believe in a model of a world that simply doesn't exist anymore. Now, we can, if we really want to, claim that things like the global financial crisis, the global pandemic, and even to an extent, technological advances are purely blips on the horizon of certainty that just need to be overcome. Or we can be more honest with ourselves and actually say there is no longer certainty. Certainty cannot be the Holy Grail. And I think when you then base that back, and I'm sorry to everyone for this very long-winded answer, Natalie,
Loving it.
but I think when you spin that back into the global human psyche, the reason I think we're seeing so much anger, so much polarization, so many people anti-establishment wherever we are in the world, and so much fragility in mental health, particularly amongst young people, I think so much of that is because we've been ill prepared to deal with it. And in a way, the anger comes from people who feel they've been lied to. And then what you have are really sophisticated populists and communicators who we can knock and hate for many reasons, but they've taught us a whole new form of communication in terms of manipulation. What they're doing is kind of becoming the lightning rod for that anger. But for me, that psyche is built around the fact that we were bred raised to believe that certainty was the Holy Grail, and if we worked hard, that would be our reward.
That is fascinating and illuminating. And one of the things that's coming up in my mind, thinking about that certainty is the quality of inflexibility of just this linear track of do this, then that, or if this, then that. And there's something very, obviously very goal oriented about it, but also there's something very fragile about this, thinking about trees that bend versus, and there was this wonderful study that looked at an arboretum where there were specific trees that had been raised in the perfect conditions, and yet at a certain point in their maturity and height, they would fall, despite there being no wind. And they realized at some point that it was the absence of wind against which to strengthen the roots and the trunk that was responsible for their fragility. And so there's something about this, like, how do we prepare in the absence? And I'm not saying that life doesn't have headwinds. Obviously it does. But when your psychological flourishing and your economic flourishing is predicated on the idea that there is an attainable goal if you just follow the recipe of some sort, how do we strengthen people at a different level when the training has been, these are the only tools that you need to be able to get by, and suddenly that safety net, those tools, that kind of linear path is failing?
It's a really great analogy. And I think it goes back to this idea that we are taught from a very early age, either through nurture or education or both, or the belief of protection from your elders, your wisers, your parents, your teachers, that failure is a bad thing. Right. Because what's always fascinated me, going back to my background, I remember when I trained as an educator. And I remember having one particularly, he was an extraordinarily charismatic lecturer. And I'm old enough to have been at university when lecturers and students would smoke in lectures. I mean, like, can you imagine that today? Anyone lighting up in a lecture anywhere in a building? We'd all be sat there. So God only knows how we're all still alive. But anyway, and he used to sit there and he used to stoke a pipe and sit on a stool in the middle of this room and have us in a horseshoe around him. Incredibly charismatic guy. And looking back on it now, I think 50% of what he said was probably utter nonsense. But we didn't care because we loved him. And he did say something that through my career I have really actively believed is true. Now, I don't know how you percentage it, but the sentiment is really powerful, because what he said was, we learn somewhere between 70 and 75% of everything we learn in our lifetime before we're 5 years old. Now, before people listening to this sit back and balk and go, that's ridiculous, Richard, I know a lot more now than I did when I was 5. You think about the complexity and speed of what we learn in those first 5 years. Most of us learn to walk and talk. We learn to understand facial expression, vocal intonation, body language. We learn about the sensory world around us. We're fascinated by everything. If we're born into a multilingual home, you pick up and develop the language of every language you hear in that environment. We are learning machines. Now, if what you do is you say that actually learning and the ability to change and cope with uncertainty is all intrinsically linked, which I believe it is, because kids under 5 don't like certainty. They don't want the same thing for more than 5 minutes at a time, right? And they're always curious. They're always sticking their fingers in places they really shouldn't. And messy. We're messy, but wonderful. And so there's a really interesting thing there, because before we're 5, most of us don't understand that making a mistake is a bad thing. If as a toddler we make a mistake, the classic example I give is we've all had that scenario where we build towers out of wooden blocks or whatever. And we build and then they fall over. Well, what does mum, dad, granny, auntie, uncle, cousins say when the blocks fall over? We laugh. We don't go, that was a really bad thing. Don't do that again. Make sure you get it right next time. We laugh and we go, come on, let's try and build a bigger one. And maybe what should we do to build a bigger platform so that the tower's more stable? We do all that stuff, right? And as we get older, we start to put a negative on failure. And I think, therefore, that's intrinsically linked. So because we put a negative on failure, we then protect our children. And I think this has become a real problem, actually, generationally. And I'm not a big us and them generationalist, but in this case, I do think it's become a problem. Again, for the right emotional reasons. Parents in an uncertain world are becoming increasingly protective of their children. And so what they're doing is they are wrapping them in bigger and bigger layers of cotton wool or bubble wrap, right? So they're not letting them fail. They're actually trying to protect them from ever making. In fact, they're protecting them from ever being in a position where they might feel discomfort or stuff they don't know or feel nervous about, right? But when we were kids, we climbed trees, we ate mud pies, now I'm not saying it, but this is really interesting to me, because in a time where we need to be able to fail and see it as a really constructive thing, or to feel stress as the tree does against headwinds, right? So that it can build back stronger. If you think about the analogy, and if people know me, they'd know I am not a fitness person. But from what I understand about one of the principles of going to a gym and lifting weights, is because you break down your muscle fiber. And the reason you deliberately break down your muscle fiber when you're at the gym is because then when you rest, your muscle fiber grows back even stronger. So my fear is we're raising generations of people that aren't going to the, into the metaphorical gym, right?
Yeah.
So they're not breaking down muscle fiber. So we're not building it back stronger. They're so terrified of failure, they don't see it as an opportunity to learn. And as a result, we're paralyzed. And we're paralyzed because we're in a kind of bunker waiting for the storm to pass, hoping that the sun will come out and we can just be okay again. And certainty becomes the narrative.
I find myself feeling quite moved by that. I think especially this idea of kind of bunkering or hunkering or protecting oneself just to wait for the perceived threat to go. And actually, I mean, there's so many pieces of research and studies to draw on here, but just a few that come to mind. There was one, as you're talking about climbing trees, there's a study that was looking at children who have, for instance, climbed trees or climbing frames, and they fall and they have a broken bone or a significant injury that requires medical treatment of some kind, and how actually children who've had these early experiences are much better perceivers and analyzers of risk. So it's not that they don't take risks, it's that they take risks with greater context and with greater wisdom. So that's an interesting, and you would perhaps think it's the inverse, right? The idea of pain being something that shocks the system, that shuts down the risk-taking appetite, and actually it's not true. Or for instance, other things like I was reading recently about the reticence many, but not all young people have to approaching someone else if you're, if you fancy someone, you wanted to, ask them out on a date or something. And it is fucking terrifying. I remember when I was at uni and going out to clubs and you'd kind of have a little, I don't know, glance at someone across the crowded bar or whatever. And it takes guts and risk, and it takes the possibility of rejection and the pain of rejection. But then the thrill is also really high. And there's something about this kind of the saturation of color in that kind of life where you are taking risks and the rewards are high, but then also the learning and the growth that comes from rejection, unless it's a chronic thing where you're constantly being rejected, which is another order. I mean, there's, thinking about thresholds of things, but there is something about learning to engage in life in a way that is rich and varied, that requires that we take risks. Because even with the certainty, I remember having this conversation with my brother years ago. He works at the Bank of England, did a PhD in physics at Cambridge, this proper academic. And I always considered him the brains between us in the sense of the scientific mathematical. I'm much more of a constellated thinker, give the languages, complex dynamics, systems, creativity, and communication, even though we both share, and I did physics at A-level. Anyway, so I was like, he goes off and I'm thinking, he's going to have this magnificent career. And he has got a career that is enriching and meaningful. But I remember years ago, he said to me, we were having quite a frank conversation. And he said, yeah, but you're taking a much bigger risk than I am in a sense that, if it doesn't work out, yes, you might be living from gig to gig as a keynote speaker and author like yourself. But actually think about the freedom that's built in that kind of dynamic. He's like, I could always get fired from my job. So actually the certainty is in some ways illusory. And I'd never considered it in that way. And, the way things have turned out, I'm very happy with my career. He's very happy with his, and they have a very different cadence to them. And yet this idea of stability, certainty, institutions that provide a certain period of, say, decades worth of post-war growth and structure in the organic world, things don't, when they calcify, things die. And there's this kind of, so there's also a conflation between uncertainty being the thing that is risky and brings death, but actually the opposite is closer to the truth. There has to be some dance between chaos and order, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really profound. I remember writing in one of my books years ago that, and I was exploring this whole thing around change, and it's a fascinating thing, right? Because
and your book is called Change.
It is. It is. Yeah, and when I was writing it, a couple of things. So the first was, I remember I've interviewed my mother a lot, who unfortunately we lost a year ago. But I was interviewing my mum a lot about why I was okay with change. Why? Because I've always been a bit, like, oh, well, let's just go on. If we're comfortable, we need to go to the right or the left or forward or back. We need to shake it up a bit. And of course, it was really interesting because so many of the people I was raised with weren't. And she was saying, and it was so wise. When I look back, I had a tough childhood, and my childhood was tough because my parents went through a spectacularly messy divorce. And again, people, to put this into context, this is nearly 50 years ago. And 50 years ago, divorce was not a kind of thing that societally was accepted in a way that it is today. It was kind of, particularly if you were a divorced woman, you became a pariah because for some reason, all your married friends thought you'd suddenly, as a divorced woman, be after everybody else's husbands, which would not have been the case if you'd seen my mum's friends. But that's another story. Anyway, so...
Naughty.
Oh God, politically incorrect. But the point is that I had a really challenging childhood, and actually there were moments in my relationship with my father that was spectacularly messy, and occasionally got really quite physical and mentally challenging. And so from a very young age, I had a kind of context for adversity and challenge. And when Mum and I were talking, what we were saying was, that's probably why you're okay with change, because at a very young age, you did have to deal with falling off a climbing frame, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, you see the world slightly differently to those friends of yours who at the time we perceived were lucky because they grew up in really stable, loving, happy, everything was okay environments. And it's really interesting because then you project forwards. Now, my kids are... my son's in his mid-20s, my daughter's 30, although she won't thank me for saying that now. But, they're old, basically. Old, they're catching us up. Anyway, the point is that they were raised in a really loving, stable, middle class, not really wanting for anything environment, right? And my children have a lesser capacity to deal with challenge and change than I did. And so they didn't fall. I mean, we tried. My wife and I would often talk about trying
Shove them off.
Yeah, shove them off. But genuinely, we often used to talk about how do we put them in, we've got to put them in the right way, in peril but protective power. I know that sounds really strong, but how do we create an environment where they have to claw their way up occasionally rather than just, and I think there is definitely something, I mean, it fascinates me, and this is probably too personal a question to ask, but in your life, so there you are, your brother very much, if you like, kind of mainstream, very successful, all of those things, you much more of an adventurer. Is he older than you?
Younger by 2 years.
Younger. So the interesting question for me is, what do you think it is about? How did you fall off a climbing frame, or did you even? And are there moments in your life where you feel, that ability, because you're deeply creative, right? You're incredibly entrepreneurially creative. Before we came on, you were talking about the music and the art and all the other things you do in your life. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm not worthy. But
this is the best-selling author, thinker, educator.
But the interesting question to me is there anything in your life that you feel were moments that actually made you more comfortable with dealing with risk and change and uncertainty?
Well, thank you for that profound question, interviewer. I'll just hand over to you.
Sorry, I've flipped the table, haven't I?
No, I love talking with you. It's such a rich dialogue. Well, so you described the divorce being spectacularly messy, and I think for me it was, and there are my experience has been there are gendered differences. I think being the first firstborn, being someone who was always quite intense and stubborn and clear of mind, as a young girl in a Catholic household,
Mm-hmm.
being raised by, and actually I was thinking about this recently. Obviously it's not a monolith thinking about whether a parent is firstborn or second or third or fourth, but I think I was very headstrong, and I think my parents probably found that quite a challenge. And then going to school, my mum's she's half Iranian, quarter French and Belgian. My dad's from Gibraltar. It's a multilingual, multicultural, multi-faith family. And so being raised in this very homogenous, small, impoverished town, there's a whole backstory to that. I was just always alien, always at the periphery. And so there was always an otherness. I always felt an otherness, but I was also incredibly like perceptive and sensitive. And I think when you grow up in a context where one of the skills for survival, built on top of an innate sort of sensitivity, is the reading of dynamics that are unspoken or hidden or subverted, that then has the potential, with other conditions in place, to make you someone who potentially can cultivate a quality of compassion that hopefully, if you're given the support through a therapist, whatever, to go through the difficult things, you then have the ability to be present to others' hopes and fears and pains in a way that you just wouldn't if life hadn't salted you in that way. And so there's salted as opposed to assaulted. It's kind of this marinading, if you like. But I'm also acutely aware of the fact that for that to be the case, and different people are different. I know people in members of my family who've had similarly challenging experiences and have not necessarily thrived as a result. And it's not about the blame thing here, but I think there's something about the confluence of having huge resources of energy, which is luck of the draw.
Yeah.
Being stuck. There are certain psychological traits that I think are very helpful in being resilient. So being stubborn, also a righteous anger of just like, well, fuck the system, I'm going to do my own thing. And especially as a young girl, seeing all of the inequalities, especially within religious or dogmatic structures, and being like, no, I don't believe in this. So I think there are things like this that you learn, but it's also, and then I think it becomes almost like a call, almost like a duty, that if you've had the experience of adversity and you've taken knocks and you've had to suffer at the psychological or physical hands of another person or the context, then you get hopefully a choice. How do you wield your insight, your compassion, your power in a way that supports the flourishing of others? And actually on that point, I'd love to ask you about your books, because this is what you also have come to do professionally. And when we speak, I feel like it's almost that there's an emanation of energy and compassion I feel from you, which is beautiful to be in connection to. And so thinking about your book Change and thinking about your forthcoming book Curiosity, and it's this kind of, it's this leaning in towards life, which is exactly, I think, what we need right now. What moved you to write perhaps either or both books, perhaps particularly Curiosity? And where do you find hope now when there are so many people who are suffering, facing adversity they may not have had to face, and are desperate for a sense of orientation and support? And it's a lot of,
Touche, Natalie. Here we go. Big question to you, and then you fire back with like, I win. First of all, just to say about my books, if somebody had said to me, because Curiosity will be my 5th book, if somebody had said to me, you'll write a book, I would have thought they were completely bonkers, completely crazy.
But 5?
I know. It's like, wow. And you know what it's like birthing a book. It's a bit like, I think sometimes, and I can't say this with any reality because, of course, I only witnessed my wife give birth to our children. But I can imagine it's like the pain of giving birth to a book should mean you should never want to do it again. But it's
100%.
Weird how quickly the memory fades. Right? So, when I wrote Change, I'd just come out of writing my first book had done really well, and that was an education book, and it was an exploration as to what we need to do to prepare children better for a different kind of future, based on my experiences as an educator. What happened after that was I started the keynote speaking career. I started speaking professionally right in the middle of the global financial crisis. So I left my school principal's job right in the maelstrom. I am not somebody you want to talk to about predictions, because I left my stable job with a lovely pension right in the middle of the global financial crisis. And what was really interesting was it was right place, right time, because I came out and I thought, as a speaker at that time, my core work and reputation would be in education.
Mm.
And what was really interesting was very, very quickly, I started being invited to talk to corporate audiences, many of whom had the big name speakers, the Olympians, the multimillionaires, the directors of KPMG, Deloitte, the real kind of big names. And they'd been talking to them about change management for years. And then the shit hit the fan. And what they realized was, on a human level, they'd got all these systems and structures and principles in place, but on a human level, the whole thing collapsed because nobody had really anticipated or thought about anything other than we'll just design a system and implement it. And no one had realized that if you do that, you're building on quicksand. Because one of the things that I said very early on in that career was, actually systems and structures change nothing, people do. Because you can design brilliant systems, but if people don't buy into it, get it, feel confident about it, feel ownership of it, you're knackered. It's why I think so often you hear frustration in corporations when they say, I'm sick and tired of new managers, new leaders, new bosses, new CEOs coming in every 3 or 4 years with their ideas and then leaving us to mop up the mess 3 or 4 years later when the new CEO comes in with their ideas. That transference of ownership. So I suddenly found myself in front of really interesting. There I was, a former elementary school principal. And I remember one of my first big events was in front of the leadership team of the Royal Bank of Scotland in the middle of the global financial crisis. And for those that don't remember, the Royal Bank of Scotland in Europe was pretty much the epicenter of the European part of the global financial crisis. And I told them my story. And what was really interesting was it was clear to me that this had moved people in a way that a lot of the work they'd done before hadn't. And I guess it was because, with more by accident than design, Natalie, because all I can be is authentic. I can't pretend to be what I'm not. I can't pretend to stand in front of people and pretend to be some great guru. I was just telling my story. And it obviously had a profound impact. And then what happened over the next 18 months or so was I was increasingly doing these events and realizing there was a pattern. And the pattern was, nobody had talked about how we recalibrate our perception of change on a human level. And that was my authenticity. That was my background. I'm not an academic. I'm not a researcher. I kind of speak about and write about my lived experiences. And so change crystallized very quickly for me as a book, because it was really that. It was about, okay, well, let's explore the human side of why we find change so hard and what we need to do to re-engineer and think differently. And when that was published, I was very lucky. Again, right place, right time. It did really well. That was followed by, if you like, then you know how when you really become interested in something, your perception awakens. It's like a magnet. And then suddenly you start seeing it everywhere. We have it in even the simplest thing. Like, I mean, if ever you order a new car of a model you've never had before because you think it'll be really interesting and different, and then you start seeing that car everywhere because your heightened perception. Well, it's the same thing, right? That suddenly it was like, oh my God. And so change came out, but then everything started to continue, and it was like, oh God, I wish, I would have, that should have been, that would have been in the book. And what that became was the next book, which was Simple Thinking, which really was just an extension of that. It was about, but why are we overcomplicating everything? Why aren't we stripping things back to first principles? Why are we believing everything has to be wrapped in complex language, in huge documents or reports? Why is it we need to sound and appear clever in order to have often fundamental human qualities and responses to things? Like somehow we weren't trusting our human nature anymore. We weren't trusting our instincts anymore. We weren't trusting our humanity. And so that happened. And then I thought, honestly, I thought that would be it. I did write another book about education, which was kind of then 10 years into my journey out, which was all the things I wished I'd known about education when I was educating kids. And I thought that was like, if you like, that was like a 4-book, whatever the four book term for a trilogy is, it was that. It was a
Quadrology?
quadrology. Or, yeah, anyway, somebody
No
will be
idea.
pulling their hair out right now going, you heathen, Richard. But it was the 4th book. And I thought that was it, right? Because I had the education book in the middle, the 2 profound explorations on a human level, which were more generic. And then the book ended at the other end with a final observation then about what that all means to education. And then over the last few years, I suppose we've had really profound moments, right? My last book came out in 2019, which was the bookend. 2020 happens, and all of a sudden we've got a global pandemic. And change was rediscovered by people for obvious reasons, but also I started to reignite my interest in all of this. And then, from 2016 onwards, really partly as a result of the global financial crisis, we saw the increase politically in polarization, populism, the rise in extreme right and extreme left ideologies, and all the stuff that came with the explosion of digital media, digital social media, and all of that stuff. All of this complexity suddenly exploded from 2016. Really, the last decade has been this explosion. And everything that's gone with that, including technological advance and now AI and wars across the world, which are, creating even more upheaval. But what really started to interest me was the powerlessness at this point. So the next real thing that started to click in was, for me, the perception of powerlessness and the fact that people were being manipulated, whether it was digitally, whether it was, through populist leaders and these extraordinary communicators. And a frustration, I suppose, that people just became angry and polarized rather than question and it goes back to what we were saying before, making themselves feel uncomfortable, challenging their own position before they demonized somebody else's position. And that increased. And I don't think that's just true of politics. I think it's true of intellectualism, academia, leadership, business, that because we were under so much pressure, duress, and fire, we really decided, well, we've got to hunker down in our space, protect ourselves. Yeah. And we do that by just demonizing anybody else's viewpoint. So that ability to question, which I think is fundamental to curiosity, became really fascinating to me. And what I wanted to do was explore it on a human level, because I think there's a lot of academic work out there about curiosity, which is good stuff, but I think largely inaccessible for people that are in the firing line. I wanted to explore that whole thing. So in a way, the new book about curiosity is an unintended sequel to Change and Simple Thinking, but hopefully taking on the lived experience of the last decade in a greater level. And the fundamental question that I'm asking is, how do we get better at challenging the positions we're in? How do we start to take control more by asking questions, of feeling that we have a locus and level of control? Because to me, curiosity is that, right? We are living in this powerless place where people feel so disenfranchised. But how do we become more optimistic? How do we become more constructive? How do we feel like we're active players on the board again? We have to start to question. We have to learn how to question. We have to learn how to be curious rather than just condemn, rather than, and don't get me wrong, I'm not a Trump supporter, but rather than just condemning him as a lunatic, which you hear people doing all the time, curiosity would say, okay, so what got him to the position he's in? Why is he as powerful as he is? What are the causes of those things? Because if we start to do that, we can start to look at symptoms. We can start to look at strategies. We can start to say, okay, but what are we learning from this? And that goes all the way back. I hope people can kind of hear this. This goes all the way back to those fundamental days as an educator and going back to 5-year-olds. Why are we so good as 5-year-olds? Because we question and we learn from those questions, right? Good, bad, indifferent. We let ourselves become uncomfortable by challenging our own position first. We're not too judgmental. And that is why curiosity has been birthed and is currently in that painful process of editing. Um, where my editor goes, really, I can't believe we gave you a contract for this nonsense, Richard. But
You say
yeah,
that now, New York Times bestsellers list. Here we come.
from
I'm
your
holding
mouth.
you to that. I mean, there's just so much in what you just described. I think so. Thinking about the ability to question, but also particularly this tension between curiosity and condemnation. I think there is also something there, drawing it back to something you said at the very beginning about how we are educated in such a way as to pass the tests. You know, there is a right answer.
Mm,
And I see this also now, just as a brief tangent, in the way that, for instance, where previously we might have done a Google search and there'd be, okay, yes, sponsored results, but there'd be a plurality of results, 10 results. And now we're just offered a singular AI summarized result, which we know the hallucination rates are really high. So there's this kind of sense of, the reason I'm saying this is that there's a sense of linearity, again, of if we just have the right answer, then anything beyond that or outside of that or outside of the accepted parameter is de facto wrong. And so we can say, you're wrong. I'm going to
mm,
shut you down. I don't need to pay attention to you. And that's where the condemnation piece comes in. And I think there's also something about, and use sort of this example of quicksand, you know, structures and systems. And I saw it almost as like scaffolding on quicksand, but there's no building to be seen
mm.
somehow, that there's this vacuousness, and that actually one of the things that gives us the greatest strength often can be this recognition of, and it sounds so banal and simplistic in some ways, but the recognition of the dignity and humanity of the people with whom we so fervently disagree. And I think there's something deeply humanistic, and more than that, maybe panentheistic or animistic, the idea of the valuing of the plurality of life, even and perhaps especially when the people that we are thinking of, speaking with, witness to, are operating in ways that we find abhorrent. And so this kind of, how do we cultivate practices not to suddenly just roll over and go, oh yeah, it's fine that you're pulling people off the street and using ring cameras to inform your ICE people to go and take immigrant mothers from their kids at school at 5 o'clock. Like, no, I mean, there are certain things that just are not justifiable, morally speaking, and yet also hold compassion so that then we can ask the questions that help us create something different and to reduce suffering in the world. But how do we, in your book, Curiosity, and also from your own experience, how do we move people, unfold people from this place of stricter and condemnation to something perhaps a bit more spacious where we can reconnect with even just a spark of curiosity to create more possibility? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And I'm not sure I can give a profound or even simple answer to that.
Mm.
I think so many of these things, going back to change, and then hopefully you'll see the context for my response. The one thing we all know about change is it's not a light switch, right? You can't
Yeah.
change anything, whether it's structurally, emotionally, anything. You can't change it just because somebody says, and you go, oh yeah, let's go, I'll switch the switch, right? Organizations have fallen into this trap for generations, or just give us the answer, we'll flick the switch, we'll implement the new system, new structure, and everything will be golden. And then of course it isn't. And so the skepticism builds and the anger builds and the disenfranchisement builds. And I think the same is true here. I think we have to look for, we have to lift up the examples. We have to, I mean, both you and I are storytellers, and I know one or two extraordinary storytellers too. And I think storytelling, although it sounds soft and syrupy right now, the ability to tell story has probably never been more important in human existence, because I don't think we are telling stories enough. We're
Mm.
not giving stories about the good stuff, the people doing amazing things, the people who are questioning and challenging in a constructive way, who are then binding communities together, who are doing things on a social and spiritual and physical level that come from story, right? And there is nothing like people hearing a narrative and going, oh my God, that speaks to me. That is how I feel. That is what I want. And, again, going back to the point, abhorrent though they are, people like Trump, and in the UK, people like Nigel Farage, who's the leader of the right-wing party that could well be in power in a couple of years' time. And I know there's similar in Spain and France and
Mm.
Germany and Austria and across Latin America. These people are brilliant storytellers.
Hmm.
And what they're doing is they are honing in on people's emotions. And people go, that is how I feel. That is me. But then the mistake they're making is going, and I will tell you how I'm going to make you feel better,
Hmm.
which ultimately will end up in a greater shitstorm.
Hmm.
Because when these promises don't come off, and we're seeing it to an extent in America, right? Already, we're seeing large numbers of people going, hold on, you promised me when you were re-elected that my taxes would go down, the cost of eggs would be cheaper. I don't want ICE turning up at my neighbor's door. That's not what I meant by
Yeah.
dealing with him. That's not what I want. That's not me. That's not what I stand for. And actually, to an extent, what we have to do is become better storytellers to find ways of helping people identify, but then empowering them, not constraining them, not going, okay, now you identify with me, I'm going to tell you what to do. So then it's actually about saying, okay, well, let me invite you. It's coaching, I guess, and I'm not a coach, but let me ask you now to ask another question, a better
Hmm.
question, a different question, a stronger question. Let's go down a slightly different route. So if that is how you feel, so let's go back to the ICE scenario, right, in America, where large numbers of people that are pro-Trump are going, actually, that is not what I wanted. So then it's a
Hmm.
case of going, so what is it about it you don't like? So how could we alter that? How could you help alter that? How might we look at that differently? You know, unfortunately, the de facto setting of people on the left or anti-Trump is, well, let's just get rid of him. We need to impeach him. We need to vote
Hmm.
him out, right? That's not empowering either. It's
Hmm.
about saying, you on a micro level, what can you do? Like, so, and I know it's an area you're more passionate about, well, not more passionate, but more active in than I am. When you look at the environment, right, just saying, and I know, you know, again, while we're recording this, Trump has rolled back the environmental protection laws in
Hmm.
America overnight, which is horrifying, right? But the question we've got to ask is on a micro level. So how can you, if you care deeply about the environment, if you're seeing climate change, not what are we going to wait for the big people to do, the power, what can we do? What can
Hmm.
we do together? You know, so to me, at the heart of my book, I think, is a plea for a rebirth in activism, but micro activism, not macro activism. And actually, that starts on a very human level. And that starts by saying you do have the power to change things. You can make micro changes, which will spread, you know, because one of the things, again, it's a term I hesitate to use since 2020, but I think we've lost the art of, or the understanding that change happens through contagion.
Hmm.
And actually, all we need to do is sneeze small. You know, like your friends and family who have been with you all week tending to your flu, Natalie, you know as well as I do, whoever has been looking after you or pulling your hair back or being with you during the last week is going to pay the bloody price because they're going to be the next one, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
that's the point, right? Because how do we just nudge and how do we coerce just one person into going, okay, yeah, I could do that, or I like
Hmm.
that idea, but you're right, it's my responsibility. Because
Hmm.
I think we've got to re-engage people in the belief that we all have to take responsibility. It's you know, it's the old Gandhi thing, right? Be the change. We've all got to take responsibility. We can't wait for somebody to come riding over the hill and be our knight in shining armor and wave, I'm mixing metaphors, wave a magic wand, right? We've got to be the change. And so the book really strips it back to, why do we become less curious? What is it in a non-judgmental way that has led us to feel so disenfranchised? And how in a micro way can we start to rebuild that curiosity, that questioning, that embracing and
Hmm.
collaborating and activism in a way where actually we, you know, that we start to build tribes of people and build momentum, and we start to believe we can change the world. And it's really interesting, and I promise I'll stop ranting in a minute, because one of the things I do passionately believe, because earlier you asked me about optimism,
Hmm.
and maybe I would say this, unfortunately, we're seeing young people demonized almost constantly these days because we're blaming social media and digital technology and the lack of human contact, all of this stuff. When you actually look at the research, and there's some really powerful research done by an amazing generational expert, Chloe Comby, who wrote a book called Gen Z, and she's an amazing woman. And I remember asking her not that long ago, what can I be optimistic about, Chloe? Because you've interviewed, I think, some crazy number, like 100,000, just thousands and thousands of young people. What can I be optimistic about? And she said, Richard, the one thing that keeps coming through to me in my interviews with these young people is that they're the most entrepreneurial generation the world's ever seen. And we weren't saying that in a kind of money hungry, greed, got to be a billionaire kind of way, but in a way that their reflex is to be more proactive and more activist than my generation, than our generations. And so I'm optimistic because I think if we can create the conditions for them to flourish and to really show that entrepreneurship, they will be the next generation that move things forward. And let me finish my rant with this. And it's, again, I hope, an optimistic state, and really the reason behind writing the book now about curiosity. When you look at human history, every period of human history is marked out by deep periods of darkness. The human's propensity for evil is pretty strong, and self-destruction. And through history, we've seen these incredible periods of darkness caused by religion or, famine or all kinds of geopolitical swing and environment and economics and all the things that we're seeing causing the problems now. But what's really interesting when you track that human history is what follows a period of darkness is a human renaissance, right?
Yeah.
A period where we reconnect with our human talent, our ability, our extraordinary nature. And we start to explode scientifically, naturally, artistically. And I look at conditions now and think we really are at the heart of that darkness. And my optimism lies in the fact that I believe I may not be here to see it. And if I am, I'll be in a rocking chair somewhere, gently dribbling. But I'll be smiling because, for me, I think we will witness in the next 50 years a resurgence of what it means to be human. I think some of the fear mongering around technology and some of the fear that comes from the uncertainty around AI, some of it will come to pass inevitably, and it will cause bad. But I also think we'll come to terms with it on a human level, and we'll start to see how we can use these wonderful new tools on a human level to be more creative, to be more collaborative, to reconnect with the world on a human scale. So I do believe that our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren could well lead the next renaissance and golden age of humanity. But I think it takes moments of darkness like the one we're living through now, as you were saying almost before, to realize you have to have adversity to realize reward. You have to have moments of darkness to realize light. And whether that's falling off a climbing frame, coming from a really broken home, whether it's living through a pandemic as a young person, whatever else it may be, I think you have to have those moments of extreme darkness, because that's when the magic and joy of the light comes through and you recognize it. And I do wonder whether we've lived through a relative period of calm through the relative period of calm through, the 80s, 90s and early noughties that actually made us flabby and complacent. And we needed to be shaken out of that complacency to deal with the challenge of the next 100 years.
What you're talking about, this darkness, I've been listening to and actually recently interviewed for the Do Radio series on creativity. I did a few opening episodes for them. This wonderful mythologist called Michael Meade, who is in his latter years and just an extraordinary man with an incredible story. And he often talks about the descent into the darkness mythologically, and the idea that in mythology, it's not just the stories of, and you mentioned this earlier, the knight in shining armor or the wizard who waves his wand, that there are other stories, circular stories, spiral-like stories, fractal-like stories, where he might not use that specific language, but these kind of constellated ways of thinking about how change happens and the cyclical nature of change. And you're mentioning it was almost like you made the motion like a trough, this descent. And one of the things that he talks about is this death, rebirth, apocalypsis, the idea that in modern Western culture, we think of apocalypse in these sort of big American movies of just like the shit hits the fan and then everyone dies and there's like 2 or 3 people, the I Am Legend or Day After Tomorrow type scenario. And yet apocalypsis is the dual aspect that you can go beyond the non-dual, but the death, rebirth, that there is this contraction that then gives the possibility for new life to emerge. And that in these moments of darkness, it is precisely, to weave back to your earlier points around change and curiosity, our capacity to retain contact with or to cultivate even the tiniest spark of hope, light, love, compassion, movement towards curiosity, which is such, for me, that's kind of at the heart of all things. It's the heart of creativity, which is at the heart of life, even though there is also phenomenal amounts of destruction in nature. I don't want to kind of paint this sort of Pollyanna-ish picture of, skipping through fields, there's blood and devastation. But I think when it comes to this darkness and being able to step with one foot in front of the other, not knowing if there will be earth to meet the sole of the foot, you can't just stand still. And so I think there's something about that, like, how do we step into the darkness together? And I think the second part is crucial. It's that together. It's this collective sense of agency with, and you intimated this when you're talking about asking people who perhaps did support Trump or did support, now another example might be Brexit. And I know people had very good reasons for supporting Brexit. I had 1 or 2 friends who did. And they were talking about political sovereignty, values which I share, but I was like, yeah, but the fallout's going to be so great. We're not going to reap. And it's a matter of opinion until things come to pass. And, but so there's this quality of how do you find ways to locate the agency and the storytelling in the collective where multiple voices are welcomed in, but there is this sense of we're not doing it together. We're creating a lattice or a field or a tapestry of active hope, of creativity, knowing that things are going to get worse, that there is going to be suffering. But there are ways in which to suffer less with the pain that is existing in the world and therefore create alternative futures that are much more regenerative, much more aligned with dignified lives.
Again, so much of that, a profound question, is human, right? And actually, it comes again, I think, from our personal feeling of shame of when we feel powerless, shame of when we feel we've failed, shame of when we feel that we're struggling emotionally, shame when we feel angry, that actually almost our human reflex is never to turn to friend, family, loved one, people we might collaborate with. It's to hide away because we feel shame, because we're taught to feel shame when things aren't working out. At school, if you fail a test, you're told you didn't try hard enough, right? So shame. If you're in a marriage and your marriage fails, it's your fault. You feel shame, whichever party you are on the whole, right? You feel shame. You don't want to share it. If in a professional environment, somebody outperforms you in their targets, you feel shame. You don't feel valuable or worthy. When you think about our human reflex, when we feel stressed or vulnerable, or we're going through a mental health crisis, it's never reflexively to reach out. It's always to go and hide because we feel shame that we feel weak or we feel that way or we shouldn't. People in responsibilities of leadership or management or parenting or wherever it is you hold a hierarchical position, the first reflex when you feel shit is to feel I'm not allowed to. I'm paid to be the manager. I'm paid to be the one who has the answers. I've got to be strong, and it comes, maybe to an extent, it comes from a kind of male-dominated historical culture, but I don't think it does, because I think in women also feel that in a different way, but feel that same profound sense of failure. I've seen it in parents, mothers who feel I can't cope. What do? They feel shame. They withdraw. I'm meant to be a mother. I'm meant to be nurturing. I'm meant to love my child. All of these shame at every level. And I think for me, what we have to do is stop realizing that the fragility of humanity is something we should be ashamed of. That actually the fragility of humanity is what makes us human. And it's that fragility that allows compassion and human interaction and relationship and ultimately creativity. Because it's more your world than mine. But it strikes me, no one is ultimately at their most creative when the sun's shining and everything's going beautifully well. And actually, when people collaborate creatively, it strikes me, you take the most obvious and most used example. Lennon and McCartney had a really, really interesting relationship, and a lot of it was love-hate, and a lot of it was totally different views on the direction of the Beatles, their music, the way they should be. But they were ultimately brilliantly creative because despite the friction, they realized the thing was to work through those challenges musically, creatively, by doing something developmental. And I think on a human level, what we've got to start sharing with people, I do a bit of work occasionally with addiction, with people with addiction.
Mm.
And the number one thing they cite as the thing that fires their addiction is shame. And the number
Yeah.
one solution they cite as they start to control their addictions is that moment where they realize they are not alone and there are other people out there like them who understand them, who group together and give each other support and guidance
Mm.
in those moments. And I think we have to recalibrate our relationship with shame.
Powerful. And it's funny that it's the reaching out that is the thing that we least want to do, that is the salve. And it's funny because it's one of these things where if someone that you love, a good friend, turns up and they're having a shocker or something, you're going through a divorce or through an illness or some kind of very deeply challenging situation, many of us would jump at the chance to help them, right? So when the shoe is on the other foot, when you get the gift of being able to show up for people, we're like, yeah, I'm here. I will drop everything. I will come and be with you. Let me be with you. And yet receiving that is so much easier to be the proactive giver than the receiver sometimes. I was talking about this yesterday actually with neurologists I was chatting with, but there is something about what happens when either we have really good friends who spot what's going on and they step in, they say, look, I can see you're struggling. I know you don't ask for help, but let me offer it anyway, in a way that's compassionate and with the open hand, as opposed to this gripping kind of, I'm going to be your savior type thing, which is a whole nother thing. But then also it deepens that thread of connection and it makes you realize that the safety net, back to your point about certainty, the safety net is not predictability and certainty. The safety net is relationships, love, adaptability, knowing that you're not alone, knowing that you don't have to struggle by yourself. And once you've tasted that once or twice, it fundamentally, potentially, if you allow it to touch you in this way, changes the way that you see the world.
Yeah. I mean, the
Yeah.
analogy I use or have used when I wrote Change was people are happy to walk in space if they know they're tethered to the space shuttle.
Oh, yeah.
And that to me is kind of what you're describing. And
Hmm.
so as a society, as people, we need to make sure the space shuttle is there, strong and obvious.
Hmm.
And then people will walk in space. And they might take the first walk out for 30 seconds and go, well, I'll just touch space, I'll take one step. I'll let go of your hand or the rail I'm holding onto just for a second. It's like learning to swim, right? I'll just push away one stroke and then or learning to walk, and the significant adult parent in your life just moves one step further, or learning to ride a bike and you put the stabilizer on, you take the stabilizers off and you go on, pedal once, pedal one, pedal to daddy, pedal to mummy, pedal to your sister, your brother, and 3 steps, 5 steps, 10 steps. And actually, that's what I meant earlier when I said change takes time. We can't suddenly feel different. Whether we listen to this podcast or read deeply or want to change the way we see the world, we want to be more connected, more proactive, more positive. The truth is, if you set yourself too big a goal, which is unrealistic, which is often a whole nother podcast, right? If you set that goal that's too big, you are always going to slip up and you're going to go, well, that didn't work. So actually, I'll return back to my shell. What we also have to do is allow ourselves the understanding that development change is experimental. It is learning. In learning, you are going to make mistakes. You are going to screw up. Things aren't going to work out the way you think, but the reflex should always be, okay, that's interesting. What have I learned from that? And then I've got the confidence to take another step and another one. And eventually, mixing my metaphors again, the next thing you'll know, you'll look back at the space shuttle and you're at the end of a rope that stretches out for 100 meters, and you are walking in space. You are near the stars.
I love that. That's such a powerful image to kind of land on or float into, as opposed to land, because there's not even a touch of land in sight. So I was going to ask, there's two questions that we can end on. And one of them, I wonder if it's repetitious to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You've mentioned a few times storytelling. And one of the things that I was chatting about this with Rob Hopkins last year, about the importance and necessity for people who, and it's not big C creative, it doesn't have to be professional musicians, artists, theatre, creator, like whatever. But people who feel moved to create in some way, some kind of story or some kind of experience of what's possible, to encourage people towards curiosity, towards taking that step, towards taking the 30-second spacewalk or whatever it might be. What story do you think you would most love people to reflect on or dwell with as we face into whatever unfolds?
Oh my God. There's a story. I hope people will forgive me because it'll take a couple of minutes to tell, but
Go
it's
for it.
the one that's fired my life since I started out as an educator. And I think most succinctly sums up both why I've become the person I've become, but more importantly, why I'm so passionate about the things I'm passionate about. So in my first year of teaching, now people need to understand the context for this. This was a very long time ago, and it was before people really understood special educational needs or behavioral needs or any of those things. Kids were just naughty or stupid most of the
Yeah.
time, tragically, horrifically, you know. My first class, I taught a group of 9-year-old kids in an area of social deprivation in the heart of the UK. And I was given my class list, and I'll keep this short as I can. I was given my class list, and I went through the names with the teacher that had them the previous year. It's my first year as a teacher. And she was going through the list, and she said, oh, this one's this one's that, this one's really smart, this one's not.
Labeling everyone.
Exactly. And we got down to this kid called Gary. And she smiled at me and she went, oh, Gary's a sweet little boy. You'll really like Gary. He'll never achieve anything academically, but he's a lovely little boy. And I thought, okay. And again, in my naivety, young teacher, before an age where we really started to comprehend and understand, you went, okay. And so what happened was, I started my teaching career with this class, didn't hold out a lot of hope for Gary, but within 1 week of meeting him, I knew, even subconsciously, I think, he was going to have a profound impact on me for the rest of my life. He was probably the most remarkable human being I'd ever met. So this kid did have very complex needs. Nowadays, you would understand that amongst those needs, he was dyspraxic, he had dyslexia, dyscalculia, he had a whole range of challenging situations. But he was the sweetest, most beautiful, kind-hearted, most emotionally intelligent
Oh,
child.
well, we need
And
more of that.
yeah, exactly, right? But the best way I can sum this up is this. So in the first week, the end of the first week, we had a charity week. And the kids were going to raise money for a orphanage in Romania. And the end of the week culminated with the children having what we call a non-uniform day. So in other words, they put some money in a tin for the charity and they can come in their own clothes. And we were doing this, and they all put pennies in a tin, except for Gary, who, when it was his turn to come to my desk and put pennies in a tin, put his entire box on my table, and money box. And it was heavy. Now, this is an area of social depth, right? And Gary has very profound, challenging needs. Whole thing. And I said, no, Gary, seriously, just give me a couple of pennies from that, put it in the tin. He said, no, you have to take the tin. And I could see there was no point arguing with him because he was about to get really emotional. This really mattered.
I'm getting really emotional just listening.
Yeah, I'll save it. It gets better.
Weeping on the podcast.
I phoned his mum. I phoned his mum when I had a break from the class. And I said, look, we've got this money. And she said, no, you have to take it. He knows what he's doing. I said, but she said, trust me, Mr. Gerver. He came home Monday, and we'd had the charity present to the kids in an assembly on the Monday. He came home Monday, so moved. He already said, I want to give. She said, let me give you the context. She said, and mum, single mum, 2 kids. Gary was the younger one. She said, I've always taught my kids that if they want something in life, they have to earn it. She said, so Gary had grown out of his bicycle. So he's been saving money for about 18 months now, birthday money, Christmas money. He's been doing odd jobs
Oh,
for neighbors, weeding their garden, cleaning their car. She said, he came home Monday, he said, I want to give my money. And we've been talking about it all week. And she said, it culminated last night. I said, Gary, you really need to think about it. He said, Mum, please don't make me buy that bicycle. I would never enjoy riding it knowing where the money could have gone. Right. So I knew this was a remarkable human being,
hmm.
like genuinely. And he was. And he left my class the following year and moved up to big school. And I thought I'd never see him again. And I wrote that story in my first book. And something miraculous happened because the book came out years and years later. My wife, who at the time was a school principal, was at a meeting, and another school principal came up to her and said, I've just read Richard's book, and there's a little paragraph in there about this boy called Gary. Is it true? And my wife beamed and went, yeah, absolutely it is. And she said, well, that's funny because I think I know Gary now. Um,
No,
I
no
think he
way.
goes, yeah, I think he goes to my church. Now, at this time, Gary was probably, I don't know, late 20s, early
Yeah.
30s. I think Gary goes to my church. Would Richard be okay if I reconnect, if it is the right, would they reconnect? My wife went, yes. So anyway, a couple of weeks later, I'm in a coffee shop. I meet with Gary. And I asked him the question any of us would ask somebody you've ever had a connection with when they return that way. I said, what happened? He said, well, it won't surprise you to know that I really struggled at big school.
Wow.
He said, but when I was 14, the school sent me on a work placement, which all kids go on or did in those days. He said, and I worked in a local sports leisure centre. He said, and it made me realize, it gave me an idea of what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. He said, so when I finished school, I applied to the local college to do a sports leisure management course. And he said, unfortunately, they looked at my application and my qualifications and they wrote me a letter saying, you sound like a lovely young man, but we don't think you'll cope with the academic rigor of the course. So
Hmm.
on this occasion, no. Now, most kids who had been through adversity at that stage would kind of give up or become angry with the world, or, he didn't. He said, so I found another college a little further away that actually had a really good reputation. He said, and I made my mum drive me on a Monday morning to the college with my application. He said, because they needed to meet me. And I handed in my application. I said, can I meet the admissions tutor? And they went, no, that's not how it works. If you get through phase 1 of the shift, you'll
Hmm.
be invited to come. Anyway, he said, in which case, give me my application form back. And he left, but he made his mum take him back on the Tuesday. Seriously, he said, I need to meet you.
Wow.
And they went, no. So he went away Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. They were so sick of him because he came back every day. God bless his mother. He went back every single day. On the Friday, they went, oh, here's the admissions tutor. Anyway, he talked himself onto the course, finished the course. Then I said, what happened? He said, then I knew exactly what I wanted to do, but I needed another qualification. He said, and there was a course that ran in London, which is 130 miles away from where he lived. So a couple of hours on the train down to London. He said it ran on a Saturday. He said, so what I did was did work during the week, odd jobs to save my money. This is an 18-year-old boy.
Oh,
Save
bless
my
him.
money to pay for my course and my train fare every Saturday. He said, I qualify. So what then? He said, then I started the business I still run today. He said, when I went on work placement as a 14-year-old kid, I realized there was no provision for physical fitness training for people with mental and physical disabilities. So that's my
Wow.
business. Then I'm like,
Wow.
oh my God. I said, what do you do in your spare time? He said, I don't have any. He said, I closed the business in December because nobody wants to get fit in December. He said, but I saved my profits through the year. He said, and I've built through my church a relationship with the community in West Africa. He said, so in December, I go to West Africa, I use my profits to pay for it. And I work on physical fitness and well-being programs with this community in Africa. So then I'm crying. And I said to him, because I'm an egotist, Natalie, I said, who would you say had been the most profound impact on your thinking? It must be me, right? It must be me. And he mentioned his teaching assistant because he had been assigned a teaching assistant for his disability. And her name was Mrs. Smith. And I said, wow. And he said, I don't know if you remember, but I used to get really wound up when I couldn't do stuff like
Hmm.
I'd forgotten how to hold a pencil or whatever. He said, and she used to whisper in my ear, she used to say, Gary, the only person that can be responsible for you is you. But if you take that responsibility, there's a whole army of us that are going to help you. And he
Oh,
said, I took that through the rest of my life. And that's when you think back to his story and his journey, and I'm sorry it's been a long-winded answer, that's the story that has driven my entire career. One, the belief in every human being that they have potential and ability to change the world. And two, that our responsibility is to help them take responsibility for that life, but then to be there to support them, not to take on the burden of their life, but to be there to support them, to be the tether on the space shuttle. And so that, I suppose, is a long-winded answer to your question.
beautiful. Thank you.
That's a pleasure. It's down to Gary.
Down to Gary. Thanks, Gary. Um, I mean, I'd love to land it there. And also, when is your book coming out? I wanted to ask
It's
you, and where
coming
can
out
people?
in because we're in editing now, and you know what publishers are like. Apparently,
Mm,
it will be coming out March 2027 because
okay.
they need that long to. I don't know. I don't know what they do with it,
Faff
but
about with
it
it.
will. Yeah, it will be out in March 2027 for the summer market, and the title is simply Curiosity. So I really hope that people look out for it and help
Yeah.
me feed my children and my growing family.
Have to have you back on the podcast for round two.
Oh, I'd
And
love.
maybe we run an event in the meantime.
Oh,
Keep
that now.
tuned.
Yeah, keep tuned, people.
Yeah, yeah. Richard, honestly, just profoundly lovely talking with you. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you, Natalie. It's been a joy, really.